Hello, this is Vulturefire, and this video is going to be a guide to the Idol of Emptiness. So this is in many ways a follow-up to the guide that I made after Aetherstorm Part 3 introduced the shrine for the first time, where I went over all of the 5 idols that were in the game at that point. This video will not be going over the basics of how the shrine and idols work. If you are curious how all of that fits together, I will have a link to my guide to the shrine in the description of this video. All of the information that I cover there is still accurate. The basics of how the shrine works have not changed, although some of the specific idol cards, in particular the Idol of Cruelty cards, have changed. You'll just have to experience those for yourself at the game, because I'm not covering them here either. This is just about the new idol, the Idol of Emptiness. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk about the global passive. So Idol of Emptiness's passive is invoke the Spirit of Emptiness, increasing the maximum status of all enemies by 30%. So what this means is that status in Breach Wanderers refers to Frost, Shock, and Arcane. And the maximum is the amount that you need in order to fill the bar. So normally for enemies, this would be 10 for Shock and Arcane, and then either 10, 12, or 15 for Frost, depending on whether there's a normal enemy, an elite enemy, or a boss. With Idol of Emptiness active, that's increased by 30%. And so that means that the initial amount to Shock or trigger an Arcane detonation will be 13, and that will scale up to a max of 26 after you've done all 5 triggers. Because the way it works is that it's 10 times 1.3, and then 12 times 1.3, and then 14 times 1.3, and so on up to the max of 20. Which is why 13 to 26 is your range. This obviously makes Idol of Emptiness quite a big threat to status-based decks. It is manageable, but it means that a lot of cards, especially ones that are adding a relatively small amount of status and then doing something if they succeed in tripping that status, for example, Arcane Aegis or Delayed Burst, or even worse, cards that key off of Frost, such as Icy Punch, all of those become quite a bit worse in Idol of Emptiness. So with Frost, it'll start at 13, 16, or 20 for normal enemies, elites, or bosses, and it's going to increase by that starting amount each time they unfreeze. There is some rounding screwiness, so I think like it's 19.5 per time that boss freezes. And items that reduce enemy max status will apply before the emptiness increase. So Arcane Amulet reduces the base from 10 to 8, and then 8 times 1.3 is like 10.4, which gets rounded to 10. And then the max will be 18, which multiplied by 1.3 is, I don't know, I'm not doing that math in my head. And so that ends up being like, I think 23, I don't remember. But it's less than the 26, but it's not just like -2. So that's how that works. The combat passive for Idol of Emptiness is that at the start of combat, this is fortunately very simple. Enemies get purity. It is an amount that is divided equally across all enemies. So in Area 1, it's 4 purity. In Area 2, it is 5 purity. In Area 3, it is 6 purity. That's divided equally among all enemies, which means, but as with a lot of these divided equally effects, rounding can result in different numbers than you might expect. So even though in Area 2, it's 5 purity, if there are 2 enemies, then each of them will get 3, because 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. 2.5 rounds to 3. So you end up with a total of 6 purity between the 2 enemies, which will be the same in Area 2 or Area 3. This also means that Baelator, who already starts with 4 purity regardless, will have 10 purity with Idol of Emptiness active that you have to get through, which is can be quite a slog. So if Emptiness is active, you really need to make sure you have a plan for dealing with all that purity, or you need to not be relying on debuffs. So those are debuff-based decks are going to have a rough time into Emptiness if you don't put in a lot of effort to manage them. And in particular, you may need to get lucky on finding an item like Crystal Ring or Flaming Sword that would let you, Burning Blade, whatever it's called, the one that lets the apply burn on strike, stuff like that will let you get extra debuffs out to pop that purity quickly. Let's get into the actual cards that get played during the fights. So, Idol of Hunger is about making sure you have a bad day. So the first one that I'm going to talk about here is this. You get fatigue and frostbite. The frostbite is a relatively low-key part of this. It can be a nuisance, and it will like get rid of your purity, which can be annoying. But the bigger thing here is the fatigue, because starting your turns fatigued is no fun, and Idol of Emptiness can do it to you starting in Area 1, which is something it shares with Cruelty, and then White Flame picks up the ability to give you Fatigue 1 in Area 3, but Emptiness gives you the ability to start your turn with Fatigue 2, which can hurt a lot, because of course the default mana per turn is 2, and so with all of your non-mana cards costing 2 extra mana, if you get that Fatigue 2 on a bad turn, it's possible that you'll just not be able to play anything that turn at all. And trying to like go off on a turn where you started with Fatigue 2 is going to be a non-starter. So that is, and Fatigue cannot be blocked by Purity, so you are just going to have a bad day. You'll do what you can to mitigate that. That's not going to be quite as ruinous as Cruelty's Arcane Leak 4, but it's pretty dang close, especially since you can't cleanse off the Fatigue. Another card here is you can get Enfeebled and Weak. This is probably the mildest of the cards. The Enfeebled can be annoying, but it can also be blocked by Purity if you have it. You can't cleanse it off once you have it, but the Weak that gets applied to you is also not a big deal. And Enfeebled plus Weak is actually kind of a funny combination, because the Enfeebled, if you don't have any other damage modifiers on you, the Enfeebled will have the effectiveness of Weak as well. So instead of being minus 25%, it'll be minus 12.5%. So it can actually be helpful to have both of those together. And then the last one that isn't removed. So these three cards. So I said I was going to cover basics, but this first card in each column is going to be the one that is played on you in Area 1. This is going to be the one played in Area 2, the one played in Area 3. The other ones, Idol of Emptiness can apply Frost to you. This is not fixed Frost. This can be mitigated by Tough or by Plated, which can be nice. Getting frozen, of course, isn't necessarily a huge concern, because if you become frozen, you just have to play 2 cards, which can be annoying, but it also can be okay, especially because if you are frozen and you draw into Idle Stones, the Idle Stones won't do their thing, because if you are frozen when you draw a card that does something on draw, then that on draw effect is negated. The last one here, this is an effect that you have to be aware of when you're playing against Emptiness. So once per fight, the Idol of Emptiness will dispel you 2, 3, or a whopping 4 times in Area 3. What this means is that you want to be careful about doing your setup, because you don't want to get blown out by this dispel. You don't want to find yourself in a position where you, for example, if you have something like Power Surge, you play your Power Surge and then you just lose your Powerful because Emptiness eats it. You can block this with Purity, but you only need 1 rank of Purity for each dispel you want to block. And because I didn't fix that, that should say Idol of Emptiness. Copy paste errors are hard. I bet a lot of the rest of the slides are going to say Idol of Hunger. Anyway, so where was I? Yes. So because Idol of Emptiness is later in the idol order, it will, if you have multiple idols active in the fight, often the earlier idols will eat your purity, or like just the enemies will eat your purity, and then you will be and then you'll end up getting dispelled anyway, and you'll be sad. But fortunately, it can only do that once per fight, and then you are safe from that at least. So of the commons, this is the one that you're worried about. Or rather, this is what you're worried about first, but once it's gone, ideally this comes out turn 1 and it's just not a problem anymore. This is the one you've got to deal with, because that fatigue can just make your day a lot worse. The other common is of course the Idle Stone. So Emptiness's Idle Stone is Frigid Nullstone. So the cards that put it in, first one shuffles it into your deck, second one shuffles it into your deck and gives you 5 Frost. And then the third one for Area 3 shovels 2 Frigid Nullstones into your deck. And so what Frigid Nullstone does is it applies 8 fixed Frost to you when drawn, and when you play it, it dispels everyone 1 time. I tend to find that playing Frigid Nullstone is a trap. Dispelling yourself is rarely worth it compared to the value of dispelling enemies, although there will be rare situations, especially ones in which you don't have any buffs, perhaps because Idol of Emptiness just got done dispelling all of your stuff off of you, where you will want to use it. You can play Frigid Nullstone when you're frozen, and that will just like use up one of your frozen stacks, and it won't do the dispel, it'll just be out of your hand. So I recommend doing that a lot of the time. But Frigid Nullstone is a nuisance, but it will not mess, it will often not mess up your turn in the same way that Sinister Runestone will, where Sinister Runestone will give you fatigue and then you just have a bad day. And Millstone won't do that to you. Another thing is that if you draw a hand that has 2 Nullstones in it, if the first one freezes you, you won't have to worry about getting frost from the second one because it will resolve in the order drawn. And after you are frozen, further on draw effects won't have an effect. So the silver cards. The first one reduces all of your statuses by 10, and then you lose mana. This tends to be a relatively minor effect. It's a lot of times, at least the way I play, I'm rarely floating mana between turns. Sometimes it will hurt because you were actually counting on keeping mana between turns, but a lot of the time this ends up being kind of a nothing. And then the other silver is you and your allies gain purity 2, 3, or 4, and then you divide purity 2, 3, or 4 equally among all enemies. If you are a deck that is struggling to output debuffs, this can be a problem. But in general, this is also usually a net positive for the player, I think, especially because it can help you deal with debuffs from other enemies. Or on the rare chance that you happen to get this before you get dispelled, this can help block the dispel. And also, but especially like if you have Emptiness and Endurance together, Endurance can also hand out purity to enemies. And so between the two of them, you can end up having to chew through a lot of purity, which can make applying debuffs completely just impossible to do if you don't have a lot of debuff application. So you'll want to prioritize picking up things like Persecute or Dead of Night in Area 3 that would be ways to help you get through all of this purity. So speaking of this purity, though, one of the reasons you'll want to get through the purity is another Idle Emptiness card. Get the Epic card that is supposed to be entirely good for the player. It creates a temporary absolute 0. The Area 1 and Area 2 versions are identical. You just get temporary absolute 0. In Area 3, the absolute 0 becomes free. So absolute 0 is one of the reward cards for Idle Emptiness. It is a 5-cost skill with retained that applies 40 frost to any enemy. The nice thing is, because it is retained, if you cannot afford to play it, you can just hold it until you get a chance to play it. It will be a temporary card, so it can be crushed by overdraw, so you may have to be careful with that. If you get really unlucky, like if it gives this to you when you already had several retained cards in hand, or after you've been given like a lot of treasures from treasure slimes, or if you had trash from Maw, it's possible that like the absolute 0 will just immediately get crushed and you'll just have no choice but to be sad. Normally this is somewhat useful. It can be very useful if you use it correctly, but you do have to be able to get through the purity that Idle Emptiness supplies, because if you just try and freeze into the purity, it won't obviously do anything. So, and that 5 mana that it costs in Area 1 and 2 can absolutely be a big issue. So that's stuff to keep in mind. This is potentially very good, but also a whole lot easier. This is one of the trickier Idle epics to use correctly, partially because it is the only one where you actually really actively get to think about it. Whereas like the Hunger one will miss a decent amount of the time, but you just don't have any control over that. So that was all the cards the Idle can play against you. Let's talk about the cards that you get for winning fights that were enhanced by the Idle of Emptiness. I cannot. Yeah. I could change this, but I'm too lazy, so you just have to deal with it. So the commons. So you get these for normal fights that are augmented by the Idle. There are 2 of them, of course: Suffocate and Cold Realization. Suffocate is stasis, deal 40 damage to any enemy. Damage modifiers are halved for this card. It has stasis and retain because all Idle cards do. And then the upgrade is still 4 mana, you do 50 damage. So half damage modifiers is kind of annoying. It means that this is less good with stuff like Mighty, but 4 mana for 40 damage is great, especially early on. I tend not to value this that much later into a run, but it can be a great pickup early if you know that your deck is going to struggle with damage, and you can just cut it once you have other stasis cards that you value more highly. Cold Realization is 3 mana, stasis, draw 5, apply 10 fixed frost to yourself. So the downside here is, of course, that it's pretty much always going to give you fatigue unless you have either gotten at least one Idle reward to increase your fatigue threshold, or you have an item that does that. But 3 mana to draw 5 is an incredible rate, and applying that frost to yourself is not a huge deal, because you can just think of it as like draw 5, discard 2 in how that works, because you just get rid of the 2 cards in hand that you want the least. And of course, the second time you play it, it won't just freeze you, and you'll just get to keep all 5 of the cards. It upgrades into drawing 6 and applying for 12 fixed frost to yourself. This upgrade is, I don't know how much I like it, just because this means that after you upgrade it, the first 2 times you play it, you'll freeze yourself, unless you have a plus max status from an idol reward or from an item. But it's still just a very good card. I think this is one of those cards that I tend to undervalue for how strong it is, and I should take it more highly because this card is very, very good. And it's one of those cards where, like, it doesn't really matter what your deck is doing. It turns out 3 mana draw 5 is just a great thing to have. So the rares. So these are the cards that you get for fighting elites that are augmented with the Idol of Emptiness. So we have Frozen Void, which is a 3-cost skill. It has Stasis and Retained, of course. You cleanse yourself 1 time. You dispel any enemy 1 time. You draw 2. And then you draw 1 copy of this card whenever an enemy becomes frozen. So the draw when an enemy becomes frozen part of this is not the most valuable thing, but the fact that this is just a cleanse and a dispel and a draw 2, that makes this better Sanctity. And y'all know how much I love Sanctity. The upgrade is just, it goes to 1 mana and the functionality is otherwise the same. I don't tend to take the upgrade, but it's not a terrible upgrade. And of course, if you're fighting Emptiness, sometimes enemies will get frozen just because you'll get the absolute 0 and then you can draw this again, and that's nice. But this is just a nice handy card to have. Cleanse and Dispel are both useful things, and card draw is always nice. So I tend to take this a decent amount. I think this card I tend to overvalue slightly, but it's certainly not bad. And then Null Shield is a 2-mana skill that is gain 15 shield, dispel enemies 1 time, stasis and retained, of course. And then the upgrade is gain 16 shield and dispel enemies 2 times. So Null Shield, the unupgraded version, I don't think is actually that good. I think dispelling enemies once is not often that valuable, but dispelling enemies twice is quite good, especially if you have any way to loop it. If you have, it can be good with Duplicitome or Spyglass. It's not a high priority target for those, but that can be very useful if you just need to, like, make an enemy lose all of their fortress or lifesteal or whatever. You just use this, and that helps a lot. It can also help you deal with powerful stacking. It can help you deal with plated stacking. It can help you deal with, to a much lesser extent, does a little bit to help you with White Flame. And it is just a good rate on the shield. Like 2 mana for 15 shield that you just get to hold until you need it is very good. This is not as good as Void Hardened Skin for that purpose, but the Dispel is helpful, and that will also help you, like, cut through Purity if that's what you need. Like, it'll get through 2 ranks of Purity on each enemy. So I know Zebo disagrees with me on Null Shield. I think Zebo doesn't tend to value Null Shield that highly, but I think it's pretty good, and I get a lot of value out of it. But this is another one where, like, both of these I think I overvalue slightly, but I do think they are both good. So the epic cards. So start with Absolute Zero. You already sort of saw this. It is a 5-cost skill. You apply 40 Frost to any enemy. It upgrades into being 48 Frost. This is a card that I don't ever take, and I probably should because it's actually very good. Because 40 Frost is a mountain of frost. That will freeze, especially if you have any buffs to how much frost you're applying, that will just freeze even a boss the first couple, like 2-3 times you play it, which is very, very good. This is just a get out of jail free card. But I tend to ignore it in favor of expansion, which is 1 mana, draw 2, which off to a great start, gain growth 6. 1 mana, draw 2, gain growth 6. That is most of what the card does, and that is incredible. That makes it super cultivate. This is a 1-card growth engine, which is amazing. It does transform into implosion if you have 24 or more growth, but that is not really that valuable of a part of the card, because what ends up often happening is you play expansion and you get some growth, and then, like, the second time you play expansion, it transforms, and then you win before you draw it a 3rd time. So it didn't matter that it transformed. But if you do transform it, Implosion is a 4-cost spell where you lose 12 growth and you deal 60 damage to any enemy and dispel it twice, and then Implosion transforms back into expansion, and Implosion itself has retained. So this is pretty nifty. This is not a bad effect to have of it available to you. That's a decent amount of damage for a very good price, and the losing of growth doesn't matter that much because, of course, in order for it to have transformed, you have to have already had a lot of growth, and you'll be able to start stacking growth again after it flips back. But I don't usually value the implosion part of it that much. Like I said, just because I am here usually just for the growth of that extra mana per turn. Expansion Plus is a pretty good upgrade. It goes to 0 mana, you still draw 2, and you gain growth 8, and you transform into Implosion Plus. Implosion Plus is 70 damage and Dispel 3 times, so that's 10 more damage and an extra Dispel. But again, we're not really here for Implosion Plus. But Expansion Plus, the nice thing about having that extra growth is it means that if you say get Dispelled by Emptiness or get Arcane Detonated, you'll still have that extra mana per turn. But overall, both of the epics here are pretty good for basically any deck. Absolute Zero is kind of expensive, but if you can afford it, it will do work. Expansion is just cheap card draw that also gives you extra mana if you happen to take extra turns. Take turns after this one. So like it's lower value in an aggressive deck where you're not going to be taking those extra turns, but all stasis cards are lower value in aggressive decks because you're not going to be drawing into them. But absolutely, I think that expansion is worth having. So that's going to be it. That is everything I think that you could possibly want to know about the Idol of Emptiness. So that is going to do it for this video. I'll see you next time. Until then, toodle.